Welcome to the Water People podcast. Today, we're in conversation with Irish big wave surfer, explorer, and scientist, Dr. Easkey Britton. This episode is presented by the Pryor Family Foundation in partnership with Greening Australia, who believe that our personal, social, and economic well-being are inextricably linked with our land and sea. Greening Australia works to restore Australian land and waters to produce healthy, productive landscapes where people and nature thrive. Learn more about their work via greeningaustralia.org.au. Our podcast comes to you from the coastal land and waters of both the Bundjalung and Kabi Kabi nations. We'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people this podcast ripples out toward. In the late 2000s, Easkey Britton was provoked by what she calls an inexplicable urge in her to go to her edge and test the limits beyond her boundaries. She stretched herself intellectually by earning a PhD in environment and society, challenged her cultural and social biases and assumptions through remote travel, and expanded her physical and psychological limits with big wave surfing, becoming the first woman to surf Aileens and Mullaghmore in Ireland. In 2010, amidst her studies, Easkey was drawn to Iran and the possibility of surf in the Arabian Sea. Easkey later became the first woman in known history to surf in Iran and found not only surf, but a hospitable culture eager to grow a surfing community of its own. Besides her work in the academic sphere, in big waves and the realm of NGOs, Easkey is a dancer, a painter, and a poet. And I have to say, she's an absolute Renaissance woman.
Exactly. That's a really good way to put that, because I don't think there's many men or any I can think of that I've come across in the surfing world who have, a high level of high performance ability, coupled with a very keen intellect and curious academic mind, and then also the creative expression of, poems and a poetic worldview, as well as also a real social conscience and willingness to work on that. And so that's just remarkable as well. And that's obviously why we've come to sit down with Easkey. And that kind of spectral nature, ranging from one end to the other is really admirable and just really interesting, don't you think?
Absolutely. I feel like she has, with her training in academia and then having experiences that very few men or women in the world have ever gotten to, know experientially, just gives her this absolutely unique take on surfing, on what surfing means, on how it can impact our bodies and impact our cultures. And she's just been a huge inspiration for me over the last many years.
Yeah, I've seen you often when you're writing or pursuing any kind of project where you're bringing, women of diversity into the surfing fold. She's always there in that conversation with you in one way or another. And actually something that I was really thinking about when we're chatting with Easkey is kind of the big wave thing, and how most people who have a curiosity for waves of consequence are kind of extreme, and it's in direct relation to the extreme nature of those waves. But we look at people like Mark Healy, and he's an extreme personality and dives deep into many things that he's curious about. And I just can't help but think that there's sort of like a baseline that's set up with people who have an interest in those serious waves of consequence. And for her, looking at those waves in Ireland, I've never been there. I would love to ride those waves. They look incredible, but they are extreme. It's extreme temperatures,
cold,
cliffs,
so cold,
and dense, heavy, cold water. And, and there's other people like in Ireland, like Fergal Smith, who are of a similar nature where, a real pioneer in a lot of those serious waves, but also a real cultural man who's pursuing really deep ethics and staying in localizing and staying local and growing food. And, he was at some of his highest surfing powers and could have traveled the world surfing for years, and decided to turn his back and on all of that and go back home. And so, I think she belongs to a quite an amazing though quiet corner of the surfing world. And I think that we shouldn't be skimming over people from that part of the world anymore because of people like Easkey and Fergal, and I'm sure many others in Ireland who are just amazing people, great storytellers. And I just love the tone and accent of her voice as well. She could say anything and I'd probably be like a great audience. So.
There was another theme I really wanted to chat with you about. So we continue the conversation from many of the episodes on our Instagram page at Water People Podcast. And someone recently wrote in, she was just sort of reflecting on how she felt like we were representing women's surfing in the podcast. And she says that she enjoys the podcast, but she feels like our representation or discussion of women surfers is often one-dimensional, and that it's, in her mind, not just about grace and genteel style, but it's about power and hacks and bravery too for women. And I just wanted to speak to that a little bit because we have sort of consciously wanted to take a different narrative than what we feel like most mainstream surf publications or podcasts take on surfing, which almost always glorifies a particular approach to wave riding, which is aggressive,
militant,
powerful, So we've sort of, consciously gone in a different direction and maybe a little bit too much.
Oh, that's cool. I think that's it's great to have people's feedback with it, and just so we can discuss things like this, because it isn't something that's often discussed in surfing media, the kind of language we use in the media, And I remember, during pregnancy and you were just having to lay down and rest for many months, and so we were tuning into surf contests on the ASP.
Yeah.
And so that was a real eye-opener, because every time someone did like a really enjoyable looking turn and flying down the line and something very complicated, a very, powerful and technical thing, the language was militant, oh, he just ripped the top off that one. Oh, wow, shredding, ripping, tearing, attack. Oh, that down the line attack. And it was J-Bay where people are gliding and flying and swooping and all these things to me that reflect the natural world beyond humans. And so that was a real eye-opener for us, I think, that time, realising, wow, hang on, a lot of the language being used for surfing is very aggressive, is really quite militant, and that's okay. That's a part of the surfing tree that can exist over there, and we are connected and part of that, but we are also sort of on another part of the tree, and that's come to mind for us a lot with our little guy, Minnow, who loves watching surfing and being at the beach and talking about surfing, and we're talking about kissing the lip or, touching the lip or tickling the wave, and we're tandeming down the line and stuff like that, and it just feels nice to have that kind of range. So I guess that's what comes to my mind when I think of what that person was writing, and just thinking about the range in surfing and ensuring that, we're bolstered and we're stronger and we're more resilient if we have diversity.
In the way we speak, in the way we experience waves, in the way we speak about waves. And so, I guess part of one of the underlying ideas of this podcast is to open up that range and, take alternative narratives. And just in terms of this person also wrote that, but thrusters also work well for women's bodies. I mean, in my personal opinion, I feel like the tiny standard shortboard actually doesn't work that well for most people's bodies in general. Although some people really enjoy them and some waves are well crafted for them. But in general, I think most of us, if we were surfing just for pleasure and not with a particular outcome in mind, would be riding slightly larger, more buoyant boards.
And less complicated fin clusters, which, you're never going to hear anything from me that positive about three fins. Three's a crowd, in my opinion. And so it is an interesting point in time right now, though, with something as silly as fin design and clusters. It's pretty insignificant in the world, but it is important to people's experience of surfing and joy, and that spills over into how we relate to each other in the lineup, and it does connect to bigger stories. But right now,
I think it really does.
Yeah, totally.
I think
just
it really
a small
does.
thing,
Because
but it's huge.
Yeah, if you think about the idea of alternative crafts, right? The word alternative indicates that there's a standard from which we're deviating, and that standard is the high performance, white, pointy nose, three-finned shortboard.
Mass produced.
Yeah.
No story.
That most people are not riding, and
yeah.
probably isn't appropriate for most people.
Well, it's a funny one, though, because we live in an area where we have point breaks and other kinds of waves where, a very bladed out, thin little thruster is kind of hard work, and so you look at people here, and often now two fins is pretty much what is being ridden the most in our region of the northern coast of New South Wales, Australia. And even when I talk with my friends that I work with at Futures Fins, it's twin fins, man. Twin fins are going out the door and they can't keep up with it. And to me, that's just an indicator of more range opening up with people's diversity in surfing, and kind of realizing the joy factor for them is the priority. And
yeah, I guess what I was getting to really, though, was that thinking about how we craft the way we think about surfing is another kind of peeling back of the ways that we've normalized a particular way of approaching something that we love in our lives. That can be different. We can change it. Culture is totally emergent and malleable. And that's the beauty of having these conversations, is to reframe the way we approach and think about being water people. Yeah, so I just wanted to interject that little bit of conversation because Easkey is she's an accomplished competitive surfer. She was 5-time Irish national surfing champion and traveled the world for many years before settling into contributing to the world at large and the surfing world in particular in such complex, rich, and beautiful ways that we dive into in this conversation. We begin every episode with the question about a time or experience after which you were never the same. Do you have a story like that you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, I find this such a fascinating question that I've been musing on it a little bit and have had the time and space to reflect, given where we're at in the world right now. Yeah, it's just so interesting because kind of I've been pulling on these threads and it's like trying to find which one, and then you realize how they're all woven together into this tapestry, and you pull on one and it all starts unraveling. And so it just kind of reveals how there's so many different, the story can start at so many different points. But that said, I'd really like to begin with one moment that just keeps coming up for me really strongly when I think about this, that certainly has shaped and informed a lot of my becoming in the wake of the experience. For me, it was like this cleaning of my lens that really led to a deeper appreciation of life, the sea, surfing, and in particular, our human connection. And it was definitely born from seeds planted like long before, but this particular moment in time was just over 5 years ago in my late 20s, so 2015. And what I got from it was, I guess, this feeling of how, I've been connected to the sea and surfing my whole life, and it's just informed and shaped so much of who I am. And I have that constant appreciation every day for it anyways. But this was an experience that just kind of really expanded that, of how surfing could be such a unique lens to facilitate so the deeper understanding of the world around us and each other. And I give it a bit of context and setting now. It began on this beach really far from where I am right now on the west coast of Ireland, in this sort of desert landscape on the edge of the Persian Gulf, next to the border of Pakistan, on the edge of Iran. So an unlikely place to be surfing in the first instance. And I'd been there, this wasn't my first time there, but for me, it was definitely the most profound experience I had, in particular with the women who I met there through surfing. And there's one woman in particular who I learned an incredible amount from. She just completely shifted my perspective on what surfing is and what it's all about and why I was there. Her name is Shireen Garami. She's Iran's first female triathlete, so total badass. And she'd come along with me on this trip down to the southeast part of Iran, where we were it was the early sort of stages and days of surfing kind of taking root and teaching women how to surf and working, I suppose, with the local community there. But she arrived and she's not a surfer, so she already had this kind of beginner's mindset and just stopped me in my tracks and sort of asked me, well, about how did I first experience the sea and surfing. So there was this huge amount of like buzz and energy around people surfing in this place, a mix of men and women. It was all completely new to everyone. And in a way, it offered this blank canvas. And initially, I got kind of caught in it being about trying to create this opportunity for as many people as possible to, say, experience something like surfing in a fun and safe way. But I mean, the context there changes everything. It's this open space where the experience of the sea, the experience of our bodies and surfing are completely different for men and women. And that's very kind of starkly real there, where there's these kind of real gender divides in much of everyday life. And yet there was this openness and willingness to try surfing, but at the same time, yeah, just different limitations or challenges depending on if you're a man or a woman. And what Shireen was getting at was just about, rather than sort of the sense of overwhelm that can come with all these new experiences of throwing in a surfboard, introducing people to the sea and waves for the first time, all these things to take in, and even how a lot of surfing is taught nowadays, of the focus on the skills and the steps. And so by asking me, I guess, what my first experience of the sea was, it kind of, what led me to fall in love with it? How did I encounter it and get to know it? And it wasn't at all through a lesson or even with a surfboard to begin with. It was just simply about play, of being immersed in the sea, experiencing the sensation of like a wave washing over my body for the first time, or getting tossed around. So it was really all about this sort of playful intimacy with the sea and how it made me feel in my body. And that's kind of, that's still how it is and why I do it. So it just led then to what actually happened was creating this space for women to experience. It didn't become about learning how to surf, but it became more about having this experience of, how do we create a sort of safe, enabling, supportive space for women to kind of discover and experience their bodies in a new and different way, to develop that kind of trust in a totally new environment that was playful and kind of instilled a sense of confidence rather than fear. So we ended up from that creating this program called Be Like Water that was tapping into this much more kind of sensory, playful, intimate experience of being in the sea for the first time. And so it was just this lovely way for me to take a step back and step into a beginner's mindset, to then witness the diversity of how we experience ourselves in the world and in the water, and in particular what that means for women. And that was in like 2015. And we actually we took it a step back even further and started off in a swimming pool. It meant then it was this coming together of a group of women where we could kind of stand in a circle, show up as we were in our own space. And there was this wonderful moment where we were just sharing these stories of our experience of water, what it meant to us. And then there was this mix of abilities. So it ended up when we got in the water, there was women who were more familiar with it, or who could swim, holding women who had never even been immersed in water before in their lives. And then we kind of took that experience of connecting to our bodies in water down to the beach, to the sea. And what happened there was just so transformative as well. It was just a really, I suppose, gentle, intimate approach of, we started with just listening. Mona, one of the first female surfers of Iran, she's an amazing snowboarder, had explained how when she learns to snowboard, they're initially taught how to remove the different senses. So they even will, blindfold themselves to feel how their body feels moving in a different way, or covering their ears so they can't hear. And it just amplifies all these other senses. So we decided to do that down by the beach, and we just closed our eyes and started to listen. And then the women began to pick up on all these other, like this full kind of color palette of sounds, signature sounds of waves, the different tempo or rhythm, and essentially just building this kind of connection, sense of familiarity before getting stuck into it. And what happened through all of that was this kind of, I don't know, there was just this total shift in energy, no fear, quite the opposite actually. And when we got in, we didn't take surfboards in, we just went in and had this session of kind of total wave play, of getting tossed around by waves and washed up on the beach, roaring, laughing, really just getting a feel for it. And that moment just stays with me so strongly. It was like this complete renewal of our relationship with our bodies, with the sea, with each other. And it's hard to kind of put it into words, but it was this real sense of embodiment. And for me, reconnecting with my own roots of what motivated me to do it, but also just seeing this amazing transformation happen for each of us, you know. And it's just such a different way of overcoming some of the challenges or limitations that just often aren't considered in surfing, and realizing that complexity of what it means to be a woman in particular in that space. Yeah.
That's such a unique and beautiful experience. I'm curious about being in the pool with those women, and specifically those who maybe had never swam before.
Yeah.
How did they describe their relationship to water in that conversation?
It was, it's just fascinating. It was such an eye-opener for me to like I'm so familiar with water and the ocean and the sea, and it was amazing to have that connection with Shiz and have her guidance, Shireen, to try to, like, for me, I can't even go back far enough to remember my first encounter with water. It's just like I've always been in it. So it was a real eye-opener for me to then experience and hear other women describe how they like literally being in the pool and standing on the edge looking into the water was going to be the first moment that they were going to be immersed full body in water. So there was even things that there was one woman who was particularly nervous. She was her early 20s, from like the local Baluch ethnic community. So it was really the only opportunity for her to experience something like that would be in this safe sort of setting in the pool. And Shireen took her in the water and just kind of getting used to breathing and feeling how your weight changes and your body floats and sinks. But the big turning point was when Shireen was helping her put her face in the water for the first time. And when she first did it, she panicked and the water went over her ears. And then Shireen explained to her how beautiful sounds are underwater, because sound travels differently in the water, and asked her next time to just focus on what she could hear. And Shireen went, held her and went under the water with her. And just after a few moments, seeing her come back up and her face just lit up, her eyes were wide, and just describing how she could hear like these most magical sounds. I can't imagine sensing the world like that for the first time. But it was, I think for me, it really reinforced this notion of how much healing there can be in something like water, especially when, I don't know, it just seemed to lend itself really well to this more deeper form of expression that didn't require a lot of words.
Easkey, when you are sharing this with us, I was just wondering then, when you went back to all of your familiar coastal places on the west coast, northwest of Ireland there, did you experience them in a new way then? Were you listening and feeling in those fresh new ways, just like those women in Iran?
Yes, such a good question, because the timing of this was also coinciding with, I'd done a lot of journeying all through my 20s, and kind of late 20s, early 30s was this transition into like coming home for me, to actually flipping it and spending much more time in Ireland, more so than constantly traveling and being on the road. So it's almost like I took this experience back home from somewhere like Iran, and yeah, it completely altered my relationship with the coast in a way where I know there was even a while where I didn't even surf so much. I mean, I still surfed, but I was more intrigued by experiencing the water and the coast in lots of different ways. So I started to swim in the sea again. I realized I hadn't done that since I was a kid, just stripping off and jumping in, and how that led me to find totally different parts of the coast that I would otherwise have dismissed because they didn't have waves. Things like that. And then just connecting more then with other people who were immersed or drawn to the sea, but not necessarily for searching for like the perfect surf spot or right conditions for surfing. And so I ended up being in the water a lot more, or I started to do a lot more body surfing as well. So again, all those things I realized I did as a kid. But then I was like, well, why don't I do it now? Yeah. So it brought a more playful element into my surfing for sure.
Sorry to interrupt the conversation, but we wanted to take a moment to recognize the generous folks who have supported us this season. The Water People podcast is brought to you by the fine folks at Sanuk. In 1997, founder Jeff Kelly started out with one simple goal: to make people smile, and to encourage them to pass it on. Sanuk has been advocating for a more playful and inclusive surfing culture for more than 2 decades, while crafting some of the comfiest footwear around. Thanks, Sanuk, for your support and for encouraging water people around the globe to protect their happy places. Learn more about Sanuk's partnership with the Surfrider Foundation at sanuk.com. Thanks also to Gary McNeil Concepts, who build cosmic surfboards for cosmic people. We love Gary McNeil's enthusiasm for building boards, and especially his passion for combining recycled and plant-based materials to craft boards that simultaneously prioritize durability, sustainability, and high performance. For custom orders and to check out the gallery of boards currently available, head to his website, garymcneilconcepts.com.au. You have a deep familial tradition of water personness and surfing in particular in your family. Can you talk us a little bit through your family's connection to surfing in Ireland?
Yeah, absolutely. So following this thread further back, but my sea obsession definitely comes from my family heritage. Both my parents were surfers. My dad still surfs. He's in his mid-60s now. But he and his brothers, there are five brothers, grew up in the northwest of Ireland in Donegal, were some of the first surf pioneers in that part of Ireland. He started surfing when he was about 10 or 11, and it all came about. My grandparents kind of decided to set up a business on the coast, running a guest house that since evolved into a hotel. And it was my grandmother who was kind of pioneering at the time, trying to promote tourism in Ireland in the 1960s, which I guess was quite a thing. And she ended up in California around the time of Beach Boys and Gidget, and she was staying in a hotel in Malibu of all places. And she never surfed herself, but that was one of the first times she saw surfing. And I'd love to go back in time and ask her more about it. But the seed then was kind of planted for her, and that she made the connection to the beach in front of her hotel back in Rasnaila, and was like, oh, we've got waves like that. I don't think they're quite like Malibu, but
they're much better, really, aren't they?
Probably less crowded. In any case, she managed to get 2 of the first surfboards into not the very first surfboards in Ireland, perhaps, but certainly the first ones to land in that part of the country. And these big 10-foot, probably pop-out boards that my dad and his brothers couldn't believe their eyes when they arrived. And I think my grandma's intention was to have them like put up in the hotel or for tourists. And she didn't intend in turning all her boys, as she called them, into like beach bums. But I can only imagine what it was like learning to surf back then. And Dad would say, you know, they were kind of just paddling around on them for the first year until they saw a traveling surfer stand up. And they're like, oh, right. That's what you can do.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
So it was, it's really kind of early days pioneering, you know, even wetsuits, surfing in cold water, surfboards. And then my mum, she was younger than Dad and kind of got into it in her teens, and would definitely say how it was a lifeline for her. And I suppose something that certainly not many women were doing at the time. And I kind of just, so me and my sister, we grew up where Dad learned to surf is where Aileen learned to surf. And then my sister's baby girl was born last year, so we're already making plans for her first surf there. So we're really, really strong roots, and it's all in Donegal Bay, which is such a powerful thing to have that connection through all those generations.
So given that that's been your experience, to have your parents as ocean-centric sort of mentors, has there always been conversations, you know, around the dinner table at night and stuff as a family about the sensations, the kind of epiphanies, and just some of the amazing attributes that surfing contains? Has that always been there? Is it a natural part of your past with surfing and your family?
Yeah, definitely. It was interesting because for me, for a long time, I competed in surfing as well. And I think growing up somewhere like Donegal, it's quite a rural part of Ireland, quite isolated, and it just seemed like the perfect sort of ticket to get out of there and travel was to start, you know, doing surf contests. And I was on the Irish surf team from the age of 12. And that to me seemed like the most amazing way to get out and explore the world. Whereas my dad is 100% not interested in contests. He just lives for surfing. And so in that sense, I don't want to put any labels on it, but certainly a real purist, and that surfing is his art form. He's an artist as well. So there was always that kind of interesting tension or almost duality of what surfing meant for me, which ultimately meant that, it didn't quite pan out with the competitive side. The other one won over. But definitely in terms of our experiences, there was plenty of conversations also around the dinner table of almost the darker side of surfing, of what would happen when we couldn't get our fix. So the energy and mood shift in the house, especially with my dad and me, of Mum just being, you know, desperate for a swell to arrive. So that Dad would get out and get a good surf, and then she'd know he'd be in good mood. So she was kind of always encouraging him out the door and into the sea. So there's that side of it too, you know, the addictive tendency. It's mostly a good addiction, but then there was also the withdrawal symptoms. Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's really good timing for you to say that, because just this morning we woke up and we got stuck into some very overdue cleaning of our living space here, because the surf's been really good around home, and we know that when there's piles of clothes in every corner of the house and there's food everywhere and there's like gardens are just growing outrageously over the top of everyone, that the surf's been good. And so we had one of those sort of moments as well. Right, okay, this surfing thing is amazing, but it's also, it can be a little bit of a bully with other aspects of life. So it's really sweet to hear, but neither Lauren and I had surfing families. So it's, I think for both of us, I can say that it sounds amazing to be able to sit around the dinner table with your parents and your siblings and just dork out on surfing and profess your love for it, which is just, it's a beautiful image. When you're speaking about all of this, I just I kind of feel a little bit jealous, actually. It just seems so sweet to have come from such a place. And it makes me curious about your motivations with people like the women you were with in Iran, where you were doing those sort of projects or the outreach sort of programs that you're involved with and creating out of just that desire for other people to experience the joy of the ocean, like you have been so fortunate to have had your whole life. Is that something that is part of your motivating force?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes from, I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, but I certainly think it has something to do with, okay, but obviously personally my upbringing and the sea connection being so strong, and just that real sense of love and gratitude, and of course wanting to share that experience because it's offered, it's offered so much to me. But the other side of it is also like growing up in Ireland. We're an island nation. We're in, the North Atlantic, and it's pretty cold and wild and unforgiving most of the time. In the case, surfing has really begun to like take hold and grow in the country. But there's also this relationship with the sea that's quite, it's really a place that's also associated with a lot of danger, fear, this, real disconnect as well. So I just feel like there's also that sense of loss when you don't have that relationship or connection to the sea, or worse, it's a place to be feared. And I think that then can lead to all kinds of issues where there's this lack of respect and care, and when we don't understand something. So it partly comes from that as well, of like transforming that into a real positive experience, and how can that alter our outlook on other parts of life and our relationship with the world around us. And yeah, so it's interesting in Ireland too, like obviously my family story is really different, passing on this really positive intergenerational connection to the sea, but there are also so many examples and stories of it passing on this real fear-based connection or narrative with the sea, especially in Ireland, where a lot of people, from previous generations wouldn't have learned to swim. And so yeah, a lot of my work is about how do you transform that space, transform it into a space that's really enabling and supportive. And then I just think it lends itself so well to opening up our understanding about how much more connected we are to a more living, breathing planet. And that's the thing, I think, with the sea, especially the ocean, it's just so alive, and it stimulates us in a way that I don't think anything else does. Obviously, that's my bias as well. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are also experiences with mountains and trees, and but yeah, my medium is water.
Easkey, I've been so impressed and inspired by your work for so many years, and the breadth and the depth of your work as an accomplished big wave surfer, as an academic, and as a poet, and the way you blend all of those things into one incredible symphony of being in the world. I just wanted to reflect a quote of yours back to you, and maybe we can bounce some ideas around that. You wrote, "Our rivers, lakes, and seas are the most degraded in the world. They hold all of who we are, our waste, our memories, our history, our ancestry, our bones, our breath. And the sea is sick. I do not see these as separate issues. The violence against women in our societies, the loss of our reproductive rights, the vast gender inequalities and abuse of our ocean are all connected. We can't be well in a sick sea." You've made a career now out of being a marine social scientist, and I'd love for you to share with us what you feel is the link between bodily health and planetary health, and maybe what are some of the underlying attitudes or paradigms that keep us perpetuating this unwellness of self and of sea?
Wow. Oh, wow. Such a question.
It's like 5 questions. I'm sorry.
I know, right? Why did I say that? Yeah, it's, I mean, that's the thing with water in the sea as well. It's such a powerful, like metaphorically, it's a really powerful way to think about our relationship with the planet, and also literally. So like this a notion that, you know, literally those environments hold all of who we are, and the consequence right now is that they're the most degraded ecosystems on Earth are water bodies. And I just think it's really, it's really telling of, well, the quality of our relationship. And for me, instead of that being a negative, I just think it's a really powerful mirroring of where we're at right now in our behavior, but also just how interconnected we are. Like, it's impossible, no matter how hard we try, to separate ourselves, and particularly from water, because it's such a connective property. You know, it runs through the earth, deep below us, and eventually all returns to the sea and it circulates into the sky. And it's a real powerful example of how natural systems work and how we're a part of this system. You know, a lot of our early geography classes in school are learning about the water cycle, so how everything is cycling. And then something happens where, I don't know, we just fail to apply that principle into other aspects of our life. And I think that's obviously, it's being mirrored so powerfully right now and so starkly with the COVID outbreak and our response to that. The world I've been working in, especially these last 5 years, around oceans and human health, which is considered a kind of more emerging meta discipline, trying to address that separation by actually bringing together different strands of thinking to shift the paradigm. So bringing together like the marine science world with public health, and then also with that sense of, I suppose, the social and cultural understanding and meaning that we hold around the sea in particular. And so that's what that's trying to do, is also coming out of that is like almost a whole new language for how we speak to each other and understand each other across these disciplines. Like, what's the relevance of the ocean for human health? Why should someone working in the area of public health be even considering the state of the ocean or the sea? And then vice versa, if you're working to heal the ocean, what does it matter about humans? So what I think is happening is almost this catch up in Western science, as is often the case, of what has been so strongly embedded in terms of deep knowledge and wisdom in particular more indigenous cultures. I even see it in Ireland in terms of those older belief systems and our connection to cycles, in particular here, and with the seasons and honouring all of that. So the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer really comes to mind, how she is an amazing example of fusing her more Indigenous knowledge from First Nations in America with her ecology and botany and training in science. And she speaks about this renewal of our relationship with the environment and how that's integral to restoring nature itself. So what's happening by, I suppose, looking at bodily health and planetary health, for me, it's that kind of missing link. I'm always looking at the interconnection. If we're looking at how to heal ourselves, if we're more self-connected, what impact does that have on our relationship with the environment around us? And if we're working to heal the environment and water, how is that helping restore the health of people around it or who depend on it? And yeah, it's a huge topic.
It's huge.
Some examples are, you could take like what typically happens, and very much even now in this new conversation that's emerging within Western science around ocean health and human health, or planetary health and human health, in particular with a kind of climate change bringing that to the forefront as well. But those links are very rarely considered, like the link even between climate change and the ocean, and then the link between climate change, ocean, and health. And it seems kind of obvious, but we've been trained to sort of think about them separately. And there is, even particularly in science and academia, this coming together, which is kind of exciting me and so necessary. But up until now, that lens has been really risk focused. So it's looking at, the impact of human activities or the impact of a degraded environment on human health. So basically the risks that it causes or the threat that it poses. And so there's all this language of danger again and fear. And in my work, I sort of look at the other narrative when we have a positive experience of a healthy ecosystem or marine environment, the impact it has on us at so many levels, like physically, psychologically, inner bodies, the changes that happen, like literally, physiologically, as well as how that spills over into other aspects. So, why are we always drawn to water throughout millennia as this healing medium? And why is there now a real rise in things like ocean therapy, and in particular surf therapy? So that's the kind of the narrative I'm following. The one that uses that lens, that's just looking at it in a more holistic way of that, how can we can't be well in a sick sea, but how can we be well in a healthy sea?
So with that example, Easkey, if you live in a heavily industrialized part of a coastline anywhere in the world, how would you guide someone living in that space to better their personal and their coastal health and the health of their waters, their closest bodies of water, sorry. What are some of the things you would share with someone in that situation?
Yeah, it's a really powerful question. I think this coming together of the understanding of that interrelationship with our health and the health of water or the ocean and our coasts also really strengthens the argument, and I suppose in a way almost this leverage of, if we really want to fight to have we shouldn't have to fight so hard to make the argument. I mean, why of course the ocean should be healthy, and it is our right, our duty to, if we've screwed that up, to clean it up. But at the same time, I almost think with where we're at right now is just making, I suppose, that if that link could be stronger, would that help support us in the fight to help have cleaner water, because it helps also restore so much that needs healing individually and in our communities. But I also think it's something that really requires a coming together in terms of collective action. So in my work, we've also looked at the impact of something like what initially seems like literally a drop in the ocean in terms of how much impact it would have in cleaning up the sea. So like beach cleanups, for example. But what we've been looking at is almost as a movement, what does that facilitate? And it facilitates this space to have a community of people come together who might not necessarily have had anything in common otherwise. And through this shared activity of doing something that's a really simple action, but actually very tangible, accessible, almost anyone can do it, to create a space to have a conversation, to create an awareness shift, and also leads to this other really important element of connection, of that like social aspect of it as well. So we were looking at, I suppose, more the social well-being impact of getting involved in these more pro-environmental actions. And now I suppose what happens in the world where, how do we still come together in that kind of way, and when how we come together is also being really challenged.
Yeah, that's true. This makes me think of the recent events in Australia that saw, up to 60,000 people in Australia participate in paddle outs to protect especially the southern parts of our coastline from big oil industry trying to insert itself in the Great Australian Bight. I don't know if you're aware of any of that stuff. That was the fight for the Bight cause or something against Equinor from Norway. So one of the things about that was so spectacular was that it was an access point for people who had previously never participated in activism of any kind, and were doing so largely because of the scale of the threat to our coastlines and our way of life and the ecology here, but also because there was a celebratory sort of nature to these events, that they were more about saying yes we love this place than they were about saying no so much. And so there was a really beautiful feeling at these events that I hadn't really experienced before. And it just makes me think of that when you're talking about drawing connections and giving people that opportunity to be together in those places, if it's for a cleanup or a paddle out. And I was just wondering if that's something you're starting to see in your work, and specifically in Ireland, if you're seeing perhaps more participation or more sort of custodial relationships being created with the coastal folk there.
Yeah, I really think so. And it sounds like a new conversation that's needed. And I think up until this point, this story hasn't been it's not that it hasn't been very engaging, but it's really, the scale of the issue is overwhelming. And it's so global. When we're speaking about, say, the ecological crises, the crises the ocean faces, with the climate crisis. But a lot of like the language that's used is so, it doesn't have meaning for people in their everyday lives. And I was really struck by listening to Andri Magnusson, who's Icelandic author, but he also wrote the epitaph for the first glacier that they lost last summer. And he has a book coming out, I think, called On Time and Water. But he talks about this, and I was really struck by what he said was like, why don't we weep when we hear the words ocean acidification? The very like breaking down and altering of the chemistry of the ocean. It's, it's so huge, and I'm struck by such grief when I think about the meaning of it. But he was arguing that it's this sense of overwhelm, and that it's such like a global issue. There's the need to, I suppose, how do you translate that into a story that has meaning for people in their local everyday lives? So it's like this translation needing to happen of what's happening globally to like the local impact. And I think the change will happen where people recognize locally what that means for them in terms of what they value most. That will then sort of lend itself to more action or a sense of empowerment rather than being disempowered by these, huge concepts that seem impossible to tackle. And I suspect like what happened in Australia with that campaign as well, it was taking something that seems on a global scale so huge to be able to then actually take action. So it's that grassroots movement that needs to happen, but it's almost deeper than that as well. It's like creating these spaces to come together, create more diverse mix of people that will lend itself to telling, I suppose, these new stories that are centered on what we value and love most. Yeah.
Part of the beauty of the experience that I had during some of the Fight for the Bite paddle outs here in Australia was the experience of community and the unity in community coming together and having a central idea to gather around a unified voice and saying we stand for protecting these spaces that gift us so much joy, our lives, our livelihoods. And I think that campaign reminded me that our lives revolve so much around either the very personal or the very global, especially with issues of environmental protection. And there's that rich middle space that we have to remember how to cultivate, and that is connecting with our local community to rise together. And there's so much healing in that and so much power.
Yeah.
I don't really have a question. I just had an idea. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and chat about the invention you've worked on called the sea suit.
Oh, yeah. What a fun project. Again, that's an example of what was born out of the story I began with the women surfing in Iran, and just, again, recognizing like how different limitations and challenges are just not considered within surfing, and how, it's not just in surfing, isn't it? It's across the board of like how so many of the products that we use aren't really designed with women in mind and the differences between our sort of the needs and challenges and barriers we might face depending on the diversity of who we are. So the Sea State was born out of recognizing, in this particular instance, a barrier for women who wanted to surf in that part of the world, especially in Iran, where you have to be covered in public spaces and to do any kind of sport. There was just nothing available at all that was like functional, practical kind of performance piece of kit to wear in the surf that offered this kind of sense of modesty other than, any alternative to, I suppose, either a wetsuit or a bikini. And so, we've just kind of created the first prototype range this year, but it was, came about after years of sort of creative collaboration with the likes of Shireen Garami, the women surfing in Iran, the design team at Finisterre, a surf company in Cornwall in England, who really have this kind of sense of, I suppose, sustainability at the center of their whole ethos. And then bringing on board actually ended up being this team of women, different designers, coming up with different elements to overcome this, I suppose, essentially this design challenge of how do you create this functional piece of surf kit that can help support greater, make surfing just more accessible to a wider range of women. And it became more than obviously just about the specific needs maybe of women in Iran or Middle East or from a Muslim ethnicity, but also for a whole range of, once we kind of got going with the story as well and it got out there, we had an amazing response of women going, I would love to surf in something like this because they're, for whatever reason, for in terms of body image or sun protection or you name it.
Mm. Can you tell us what it looks like?
Yeah, it's designed using this Econil fabric, so it's recycled, being largely recycled fishing nets and things like that. It's also like super lightweight and quick drying, and it's kind of essentially like a tunic, like almost like a play suit, like a kind of a onesie that's sort of cropped below the knee. And this is this really cool pattern, and the reason for the pattern is to sort of almost like create that sense of like distorting the body image. So to play on that, it's super comfortable to wear as you kind of like step into it through the back. It has this cross strap on the back, and then it has a hood that you can pull up or keep down. So it's essentially just this one piece of clothing, and you can wear it. Some women wear it over leggings, or it can just be worn by itself. I guess I like the creation of it. It came about through design students at a couple of different universities in the UK as part of their final year projects, creating the design, the pattern. And then a prototype was made by this initiative called Maker HQ, also founded by women, to create the prototype. And then we tested it at the Wave in Bristol. So it's this new, just open kind of wave garden, wave pool. But their whole ethos is all around, again, accessibility. And it's the first one designed that's fully designed for adapted surfing and all of that. But it was great experience to try a wave like that out, to actually test a piece of kit, knowing that we were going to have waves. So that was it. It was a good use of a wave pool. So I don't know what will happen with it next. We kind of were just getting ready to sort of send it out into the world, to these different corners of the world, different women and girls to try out and then capture their experience of it and then give more feedback to do an actual production line.
Easkey, I'm curious, are you a coffee drinker?
Oh wow, that's a different question. Where am I with coffee? I'm like one cup in the morning, and then that's it. I can't have any after 12.
I'm just curious because it seems like you have a lot going on, and I was just wondering where your energy comes from, because I would like to have a bit more of that myself.
Oh wow! Yeah, not from coffee.
Not from coffee. Yeah. Well, it's just impressive. It's been great leading up to having a chat with you here to really have a look at all of the things you're so passionate about and actually enacting. It's so wonderful to have bright minds in surfing, and there's plenty of those, but also those minds turning those thoughts and cares and concerns into action is really wonderful. And I was really inspired by your trip to PNG, into Papua New Guinea, and the Pink Nose project. And I would just like for people who are listening to this to get a gist of what that is about, and then perhaps where it is at this point in time.
Yeah, it's a beautiful initiative, an amazing example of, again, like using surfing to open up a space, how I see it, open up a space of possibility to address what are really kind of sticky, complex issues that can also create almost more conflict. And how do we address them in surfing as a community? So in Papua New Guinea, there's an initiative called the Pink Nose Surfboards, and it was instigated by the Surfing Association of PNG and Andy Abel, who's the president. And it was to address initially in PNG, there's a lot of surfboards that get donated, like as they call them, the fiberglass boards, to differentiate from their own boards made of, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. They're amazing wooden boards, or palangi. And so they're very dependent on these donations, and then they get sent out to the various clubs. They have quite an interesting surf management plan. That surfing there is very much managed as a resource. So it's really interesting to see that as well. So already there's this kind of system there. But what was happening was there was, women who surf in PNG as well, but they were getting really limited access to these boards because typically they'd be taken over by the guys as soon as a nice new quiver would arrive. And largely also because women's responsibilities and workload and time constraints were massive. And so by the time they would get any free time, if they had any, then all the guys would already be out in the lineup on all the boards. So it was seriously limiting. And then, when Andy kind of witnessed this, he was like, right. And he just kind of started out by making this rule of 50-50 rule of painting half the noses of the boards pink. So sort of designating that they were then for the women and girls. And I suppose there's a tongue-in-cheek play, on the whole kind of machismo that's also there in surfing, of the use of the color pink. And and so it was almost in this kind of playful way introducing that. And it seems so simple, but I mean, the knock-on consequences were really interesting to witness. So I was over there in 2015, 2016. Gosh, time is flying. Just to kind of, the whole initiative had just been launched. So just to kind of witness the impact and then go back the following year and seeing, what had happened and what the experiences of the women and girls were. And it was just interesting, I guess, by simply kind of giving that recognition, it also led to a different shift in terms of, how women and girls saw themselves, but also when there was more and more of them out in the lineup, how that impacted, the guys' attitudes, how to also create a space to encourage other girls to come in and try it. And when I was over there, a couple of the girls who've been surfing for quite a while, one young woman called Ruthie in Tupira Surf Club and her friend Stephanie, they wanted to create a space for women and girls to come together. So a bit like what we did in Iran. They ran this sort of women's surf day. It was just amazing. So the whole lineup was full of just entirely women and girls on these pink nose boards flying around. And a lovely kind of knowledge exchange and mentorship. So I suppose in terms of how you create something offering the equipment isn't just enough. How do you create wider supports? And then through the sort of surf management plan, with the money that came in through surf tourism, also then looking at things like, how do you provide more and better sort of childcare support so women actually have more time to then do something like surfing. And so it's really interesting looking at it as this sort of integrated approach. And they even took it a step further and also used it as a real talking point, in particular around violence against women, and made this declaration of surfers against violence against women, which is a huge issue in PNG, but also, globally, and is not really something addressed in surfing either. So it was just interesting to see this different space of possibility and the different then supports that enabled women to sort of step into that more and more. And then one of the other activities I think has been really crucial for that is, at least in Tupira, in that particular surf club, is the wooden surfboards. So I know there's been great collaborations between amazing surfboard shapers in Australia with the guys in PNG, and kind of breathing new life into that very ancient craft of creating in a more sort of self-sustaining way these wooden surfboards. And I know Ruthie has been really active in doing that as well. And yeah, so it's just interesting to see the evolution that integrates sort of the deeper, richer parts of a culture, bringing in more contemporary elements of surfing, but in this new way. That's been,
it's really exciting, and it's really admirable. And I don't think I could say that about 99% of the surf colonialist sort of ventures that have happened around the world over the decades. You know, in most areas where surfing has inserted itself, you know, just think of places like Indonesia and Central America and many, many other places. It's just been money-making ventures for a select few at the cost of a lot of local cultures and individual lives and everything like that. It's not a very pretty track record. Do you feel like what's happening there is due to that history, perhaps? Are the people involved there, like Andrew and whoever else you've been working with there, are they aware of the history surfing has had in other places like PNG?
Yeah, very much so. I think there's probably a combination of factors in PNG that has lended it to this certain kind of model of how to do surfing and surf tourism in a more sustainable way, but also in a way that taps into the existing culture and understanding connection to place, and this notion of even the relationship with the sea and waves, and how that's just seen in a different way, and then using that to their advantage. But I think it had to be initiated from within, with support and collaboration obviously from the outside. But it was interesting to see how much could be learned from, it was almost flipping the script on its head in terms of surf colonialism. And I know they've been invited to go to other parts of the world, like in particular in Fiji when they were opening up Cloudbreak again. And it's so interesting, isn't it, of how do we foster more positive relationships with these places that we love, that then we almost love to death. What is it there that made it different? And I don't know, it was interesting to see it, like say somewhere like Iran, where surfing has only emerged on the scene really recently. So, when I first went there, and it's basically just within the last 10 years, the last 5 years really, and introducing it in a way that has that sensitivity again to local culture and customs. But even there, witnessing again this, coming together, and the opportunities, but also the challenges and tensions when you're bringing together, even within a country, you have people from, say, urban class in cities in Tehran coming out to this sort of much more regional, isolated part that's very traditional, and then this mixing happening, which can be great to have this social mixing, but also then how do you navigate the tensions that are inevitably going to come up? It was intriguing to see there in somewhere like Iran. Is it inevitable that there's always going to be these certain tensions, and that surfing is going to splinter off into, how can we make money from it, or how can we turn it into a competitive national sport, or how can it just be this thing that's wonderful opportunity to come together and play? And I think it can be all of those things.
Yeah. Gosh, you've been involved in so many amazing projects, and you've already spoken about a couple that address both women in surfing and environmental issues as they relate to surfing culture. And I don't quite know what my question is, but I'm just wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about the connections between the way women have historically been treated within surf culture and the way we've tended to treat our coastlines. And I guess I'm thinking specifically about philosophies like ecofeminism that draw parallels between pollution, physical pollution, like, plastic pollution in our marine environment, or social pollution, like racism or sexism, and how they similarly illustrate a power over approach rather than a collaborative approach. And I'm just wondering if those kind of philosophies have informed your study and your work over the years.
Yeah, that's such an important question, and isn't that ultimately the shift that's really needed? Is this more feminine way of being and doing in the world? And by that, I mean this embodiment of a deeper way of connecting and listening, of facilitating a space for cooperation and collaboration, an approach that's cyclical, that isn't all about this constant push and drive. And, so that it's a balance of those forces of I suppose also the more masculine elements, that certainly an energy that's needed at certain times when it's like, got to get shit done. But that's really dominant. And just speaking personally first, of seeing and experiencing that in particular in academia, as well as surfing. But it's so harmful and toxic when you're in that space, that's that always on mode, where there's that set expectation of this is the bar you need to reach or hit, or the output or the deliverable, or focusing always on the end product, or what can I extract from this, for me or for my research paper, whatever it is, rather than that just doesn't leave space for looking at, well, what's the process, and how is the way we're doing this maybe impacting the result, or why is there such high levels of burnout for people who are working to really help restore the ocean and do this healing work? Why are we burning out, and why is that so high in academia? And there's just this erosion of any space to sort of reflect or think or value any of those more feminine qualities, like the importance of rest. And yeah, I just find that for me personally, it's really, it's been tough, but I've chosen, it's very hard to stick your neck out and sort of go, wait, hang on a minute, this isn't working and it's not healthy, and to actually take a stand and try to do it differently. And I've tried to see how that's possible from within the system. And then for me personally, I'm feeling a pull to more sidestep out of that for a little while to create my own space. And maybe that's the best way to initially do it, to help create. By doing that, then does it open up space for others to sort of see that that's possible, and then create this new space of support. So I'm speaking broader beyond I suppose surfing here, but certainly, I mean, when I felt it when I was competing as a female surfer, and then this is now a few years ago, so it's I'm sure it's since changed, but it was almost this experience of very isolating, certainly not encouraging any sense of cooperation, collaboration, support, or sisterhood, to put it that way. I mean, I found that when I went to Iran, and it was when I was becoming really disillusioned with the competitive scene. But it was almost like, because you're a competitive surfer, that everyone had to be pitted against each other to realize what it was we most wanted, rather than supporting each other. I don't think it was always like that, but it was certainly the time I was in that space, it really felt like that. To the point where you can end up believing that women don't have each other's backs, which was pretty harmful. And then this other mode of being, it was like this way of surfing that had to always be, again, embodying those more masculine traits of being aggressive, of, again, being constantly on, training, actually, rather than tapping into your cycle, suppressing it completely. So even though I was quote unquote an athlete, actually realizing later on in life just how detached and disconnected from my body I was. which is, yeah, that was quite a wake-up call.
Was that part of the impetus for making a lunar cycle?
Yeah, yes, definitely. So that personal sense of like loss of feeling of my own body, of what it felt like to be in my own skin, that just wasn't represented anywhere else. Of kind of going to surf film festivals in Ireland that would celebrate the winter sessions, and of course it was 99.9% all guys, which, I mean, I got to say, I think is shifting. But it wasn't the fact that, okay, well, women weren't there and we weren't visible, but also this, I realized there's, for me as a surfer in Ireland in cold water and in a wetsuit, and that wasn't visible. But it was more than that. I mean, the narrative is different if it's coming from a woman. And so there also wasn't any female storytellers, in front of or behind the lens. And I felt like both men and women were missing out from that, and that there wasn't this, again, this more feminine perspective of how we experience surfing, regardless of our gender. That, again, that kind of intimacy, that full sort of, there are other examples actually, and I think about it like the likes of, say, Mickey Smith and Dark Side of the Lens is an example of that more, I would say, feminine embodiment of that intimacy with the sea. But by and large, I've just felt saturated with a lot of what I would call wave porn.
Yeah.
So the lunar cycle was born out of, actually, as a woman, how does my own inner cycle influence my pull to surf or not surf, and what is that like in different seasons, in particular in winter?
And you've spoken about how monitoring your own cycle, tracking your own cycle, has been a source of empowerment and a renewed sense of leadership in your life.
Yeah, it's been amazing. So with the lunar cycle, I'd already been tracking the influence of the moon, of different phases, of how that might influence my energy. And I think it was in a way to sort of, I was basically initially started off tracking, okay, where does my energy go? Why do I always seem to hit this slump, especially like, midpoint through the year, of riding on this like edge of burnout? And yeah, with gaining then that extra layer of, it only happened really a few years ago, of realizing, oh, okay, I'm tracking the seasons, I'm tracking the moon, what the sea is doing. I just totally hadn't thought about my own menstrual cycle. And it was like this keystone piece that when I got it, and it just like fit, and it all kind of clicked together for me. And it just, what it does, it gave me this sense of, this sort of deeper sense of connection, of my sense of self and sense of place, that was fluid, that could shift, that was dynamic, but that was still me, even though I was experiencing all these changes, or I would respond to things differently. And I began to understand, oh, well, yeah, we're also going through this cyclical change and transformation within ourselves every cycle, every however long that is for each of us. And so then it gave me permission to be like, was way less hard on myself, to challenge that dominant masculine kind of mode of, especially in the world I've been in, which is, as an athlete and an academic, of, delivering, getting shit done, even my tendency to just not want to like, they can be admirable qualities, but not wanting to like let go or give up, or always like finish what you started, that kind of attitude.
Yeah, if we're adhering to that intense, don't give up, keep going at all costs paradigm, then it's easy to see our bodies as betraying us each month when we feel anything but at our most physically powerful, mentally sharp, and aggressive.
Yeah, it's just brought me into a lovely reconnection with my body, just a much more, I'm just so much kinder to myself. I still struggle, especially when a lot of the world doesn't really mirror that energy. but just this, yeah, permission to rest. It's like, and literally this ability to really listen and trust, I suppose, also trust my body because of this sense of betrayal that was so inbuilt. And then also being home more. So, and interestingly, right now, being a lot more still. So, actually noticing how that plays out all around me all the time and in more natural systems. It's like, oh, yeah, it's, in nature, there isn't 100% growth, all the time. There's a certain element of of decay, and that's so important as well. Yeah, so I'm probably getting way philosophical now, but
no, it's wonderful.
Easkey, I'm curious. It sounds like it was around the same sort of time that privately you were going through these changes, but also politically in Ireland at that time was the successful movement to legalise abortion there in your country. And so were you seeing a different space around you? Were there new conversations happening in your community and in areas that hadn't been happening before around that issue?
Yeah, that's so true, isn't it? Really interesting to think about the timeline. Yeah, we had repealed the Eighth Amendment around the abortion rights and laws in Ireland, which was so phenomenal, really, when you think about it in context. A lunar cycle came out that year as well, which is super interesting. And yeah, I think the big transformation was actually this space for women, and it was a space then that actually, with the whole campaign, it was super challenging, and I still never believed it would have been possible, given just how entrenched Ireland has been until incredibly recently under the rule, literally, of the Catholic Church in every facet of life and society. I think what was really transformative about the campaign was that it was focused on I suppose the yes vote was on love, and how do you create this supportive, enabling space to tell these stories of lived experiences that touch all our lives, and realizing then by the telling of the stories of just how connected we all were. We were all touched by this experience. It wasn't something that belonged to someone else or someone else's problem. It was a thread in nearly everyone's family life or story. So there'd never been space given to that or permission to share. And there was this lovely campaign, again, the grassroots one, initiated by some women. I think it was, in her shoes. So that idea of really stepping into someone else's shoes. But again, creating those spaces to sort of to listen and to be heard. It's just so fundamental.
Well, I'm so grateful for your lunar cycle piece as well, because previous to that, I actually have felt really embarrassed for surf culture and surfing that the only mention of women's cycles is, if you were to go on the internet, would be from Laird Hamilton saying that it's every shark attack is because of some woman being out in the water on her cycle. So,
oh no!
It's like, I think we can do a lot better than that, Laird, and I think it's really it's beautiful that you are open to sharing and doing so in such a poetic way. I really appreciate that, because it does feel like a lot of what our surf media booms at us, because I don't think it's a reflection at all. I think it's just booming at us, these very aggressive, loud, sort of marketing spin style projects. And I just really appreciated that you took the time to do something that was more gentle and introspective and just poetic in a space that is just full of that anyway. Like, how do we all feel when we're sitting there in a lineup looking at a wave spinning toward us, and the light dancing off the lip, and the sound in our ears, and the feeling in our belly, and the scent of the moment, and all of those feelings, all of those reflections we have at those times are so just naturally poetic. So I really appreciate that you are willing to have those experiences, but then to share them. And I feel like it's really important to do that. So good on you for that. I just wanted to say that.
Oh, wow.
Really
Thank you
important.
so much. Yeah. Oh God, it's incredible to hear you say that. And about Laird's comment, because it speaks to a question you had before as well, Lauren, about that mirroring and connection between, our polluted seas and polluted bodies, and around women's rights, especially reproductive rights and so on. But this feeling I had of like terror that I carried within myself every cycle when I was, in my teenage years through my early 20s, or kind of that height of my competitive years too. And one, it was this total suppression of this thing that felt like a betrayal every month, and then this lived fear that I was in some way like contaminating or polluting the water, because I bled, and instead of it being actually this celebrated as this really like my source of power, and actually just how incredible and the total opposite that it is, how life-giving it is, and just then the staggering lack of, the more I do this work, the more I feel it expanding, but also then how I'm still so shocked that there's this a huge level of huge level of ignorance around it. But then that just lends itself to like further, fuel to the fire to keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah, there's no shortage of motivators out there. I really wanted to just touch on this one quote of yours that speaks about balance and I guess embodying some of these lessons, or whatever you want to call them, epiphanies perhaps, from surfing, where you talk about true balance, and your specific words are true balance, a constant and dynamic process of subtle but deliberate shifts between leaning over the edge and coming back to our center again, all the time aware of our alignment with self, board, and wave. It is the same principle of achieving a mindful balance between local and global, individual and social, creative and practical. Instead of choosing between them, surfing can teach us how to weave these dimensions together. And I just found that to be so beautiful. And I just perhaps wanted to get a little window into how you're living that right now, because we're talking to you and you're in a van on a plot of land, and your partner's building a little cabin, and you're talking about returning back to your roots there over the last few years. And I just felt like it would be I'm just curious actually, just to see how you're embodying some of those ideas right now.
It's a lovely feeling to really allow myself to do that. I mean, it's lovely to hear the words reflected back, because I think for so long I tried to contain them all. All those different aspects and elements, or to be one thing and lessen or dampen down the other. And then when I got to the point of realizing that kind of understanding of what balance is, just always being told that, oh, you really need to focus your attention on, this one thing. You have to choose. It can't be both or whatever. And then, this understanding of balance being actually, if it's a fusion of all of these things, or if it's threading the line between them all, and that it is dynamic, so that there isn't any sense of actual stability. Once I kind of realized that, I was just like a sigh of relief, because that was the sort of the end of this constant striving to find that stability, or accepting that it was okay that I didn't feel that need to have that stability. Hence I'm in this kind of quite liminal space at the moment, where outside and inside are very close, in this little caravan in the west coast of Ireland, and situating myself where I can see the sea and draw upon it, because I know that that's my source of strength, and then slowing down enough to be able to literally root into the earth here in Ireland and start growing things. And also just recognizing that it all takes time. I feel I've been in this process of homecoming for for a really long time, for definitely the last number of years. And it's only maybe now I'm feeling this settling into that, feeling like I'm beginning to embody the words that I wrote. Yeah. And then I think the dynamic part is key, because it's also okay to feel like I've never quite, I never feel like, oh, I've nailed it. Got everything in alignment just how I'd like. Actually, that makes me feel really unsettled whenever everything feels too calm, which is part of the appeal of surfing. You're again always leaning on that edge. So yeah, with my life right now, it's bringing in, I really feel nourished by being able to do that kind of work I do as a marine social scientist, while also, struggling and being wary of the demands that sometimes requires, that doesn't really align, and finding a way within that to, I suppose, not surrender to the status quo. And then surfing for me now being that space that really holds me and that is my space of play. So that really nourishes. And then by also starting to slow down physically in terms of my own movement. They're my balance points at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks to Easkey for sharing so generously from her spectral ocean life. You can learn more about her work on Instagram at Easkey Surf. Special thanks always to our sound engineer and in-house musician, Shannon Soul Carroll. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my partner in rhyme, Dave Rastovich, thanks for making the time to listen with us. We'll be continuing the conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast. You can find every episode and some extras on our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com.